I'm so glad MadPack from Game Theory is getting into real history, although this is on his Food Theorist channel. And this is the history of the entire world according to bread. I absolutely love the reference here to one of the greatest YouTube videos of all time. It's kind of funny he's doing history when I just recently have been talking about what if Game Theory had their own history channel. History theory seems like a great idea. Talk about alt history scenarios. There's no way he's going to remember this, but I actually ran into MadPack like several years ago at E3. It was like in a media back room and I was just eating breakfast. I'll never forget that.
This is a planet covered with people. Different people.
But where's the
all
bread?
kinds of people. For thousands of years, all these little people will join other little people to take over other little people.
That's
the
right.
little people that conquer the other little people will all use one thing and one thing only.
I'm guessing bread. Yes. So this is going to kind of be a little bit musical because of Bill Wirtz. I love it. 7 food theories remain. Oh,
Hello,
man.
Internet. Welcome
He's almost
to
gonna
Food
leave us.
Theory, the show that's laying down a trail of breadcrumbs that leads directly to world domination. Today's food theory has been on my bucket list, my bread basket list, for a while now.
I'm excited.
And no, it might not be the most searchable. No, it might not
Bread
be
is
the
actually pretty OP. I don't know if you knew that. Bread is based.
trending thing on TikTok, but it's always been trending in one place, my stomach. I'm
I
talking
do
about
love bread.
This episode is an homage.
I actually can't even really explain how much I like bread. I will literally eat a random slice of bread if you give it to me in the morning for breakfast. I don't care. And I know people would make fun of me for that, but historically speaking, that's like the most normal thing of all time. Like just eating bread. That is what we consumed for a very long time.
The humble loaf from baguette to brioche, soda bread to cornbread,
Yes.
sourdough, ciabatta, challah to chapati.
See, this is
or
the
just
beautiful
those
thing
unlimited
about bread.
breadsticks over at Olive Garden.
Everyone
I
has
love
their
them
different
all.
types
And you might
of
think
bread.
that it's the pillowy texture I like, the science of baking, or some sort of weird dark lore about the Pillsbury Doughboy. Oh no, my friends.
I hope
my
we get
feelings
into
for
that.
bread go much deeper. I love bread because bread means one thing. How?
I also feel like bread gets a bad rap. Everyone thinks that bread is like purely unhealthy. Not really.
There's nothing more powerful in this entire world than the mighty loaf. Who run the world? Bread. You look skeptical. I get it. All you carbophobes out there don't think that you could take over the
Carbophobes.
world using just bread. If you doubt the power of this puffy hot dog holder, that only means one thing. And I'm gonna have to spend the next 18 minutes or so convincing you in the
More
most
like 24.
unhinged way possible that bread is the most powerful
Nice
substance
editor's note
on the
there.
planet. To show you this, I'm gonna have to tell you the entire history of the world in bread. By the
Oh,
time we're
man.
done, you'll not only have
I
a
wanna
new
hear the
favorite
singing.
food, but you'll know how to use it to conquer the
It won't be my new favorite food. It already is my favorite food. I like just cheese on pizza. That's it. Don't give me anything else.
world. Grab a slice for the road, everyone, because this one
like
is gonna be a trip. Now, if we're talking
the
about bread
whitest thing
conquering the
ever.
world, we're gonna need to get a little handle
And
on the world
pizza.
itself. So for all
No flavor. I like it.
of you who weren't finalists in the geography bee in high school,
Let's go.
congratulations
Geography. Okay, here we go. Now I'll be able to actually talk about my own expertise.
on doing literally
Kind of.
anything else. We're just gonna catch you up here. This is the world. And
Really?
this right here, that's me, showing you how to conquer the whole thing with carbs. Your next step will be to forget everything that you learned in 12 years of history class or whatever.
Yes.
The only thing that you
Well, especially if you went to history in America. If you learned history in America, they really don't teach us the right stuff, I feel.
really need to understand about history is bread. Bread, like all of us, starts from humble beginnings here in Mesopotamia,
Course.
where it's 30,000 years ago and bread isn't bread yet. It's instead
course.
just some random seeds of grain. Here we are, little ancient people, freshly emerging from the primordial ooze, wandering around killing
So
things
this
with
is
sticks
obviously the beginning of agriculture. We're no longer doing the whole hunter-gatherer thing, and bread is probably a big reason for that.
to figure out which leaves we can eat. Someone has the weird idea to eat some wheat seeds
Make sure
growing
you
in the
write
wild.
that down.
They smash them up a little, mix them with some water, and drop them into the fire until they're crispy. Voila,
Bam.
bread. It's not much
That
to
easy.
look at. It is a weird, pulpy little
Ugh.
cracker.
I would
but
eat that.
We love it. Because, let me tell you, it is better than eating bug
I mean, because you can put wheat anywhere. Wheat crops literally can grow anywhere, right?
leaves. The record
Some
of
places
ruins from
grow it
this time
easier
shows
than
that
others,
bread
though.
is first found in ceremonial and sacred places, meaning that we thought it was pretty cool. A special
It's also
awesome
making me think about certain parts of the world that are known as the bread baskets. Thinking of Ukraine, heartland of the USA, can be considered a bread basket.
cookie of carbs, and we love these ugly little wheat slabs so much that we're like, hey, what if we stopped wandering around and just waited for more of these wheat seeds to grow? And so that's exactly what we did. When you learn history, you think people just stopped being nomadic and then started to develop agriculture, but really
Not
it was the other
exactly.
way around. We were like, hey, bit of bread addiction happening here. This is the best thing since
Hey,
sliced
y'all.
itself, so we're just gonna sit here until more of it grows, and thus civilization
That's a lot easier than going around and hunting literally every single day. You can be way more productive if you're just kind of sitting around. You have time to do other things, which is a big reason why humans took over.
was born because people wanted to eat more toast. From there, the
That's it.
popularity of bread, like any great celebrity,
And it was gonna
goes from
spread.
fact to legend. For ancient Mesopotamian civilizations, wheat becomes deeply entwined with mythology. mythology. The Sumerians
The wheat
developed
gods.
Nisaba, the goddess of grain and writing.
Sumer.
She's a very big deal. Over time, bread hits the road, carried by the people who are still wandering nomads, all the way over
Dang.
to ancient Egypt, where there are some cool new kids in town
They're literally gonna make giant triangles in the desert because of bread. I mean, that's kind of what it comes down to.
themselves the pharaohs. Turns out the Egyptians have a little annual event that's pretty helpful for growing wheat.
flooding
They all live next to this enormous river, the Nile, which was full of crocodiles and baby Moseses, and was also very good at doing one thing every year,
Fertilizing
having a flood. The yearly
the
flooding of the
land.
Nile, which is part of the natural water cycle of the region, ends up leaving behind a massive area full
Fertile
of well-watered
region.
crops with no hauling of water.
I mean, this is really why Egypt was so successful. It was almost like clockwork how the Nile worked, whereas other places of the ancient civilizations, it wasn't always a guarantee like this.
No digging fancy irrigation lines that no one's invented yet to grow these crops, at least until bread comes around.
Ooh.
Turns out, people are gonna do a lot of things to get themselves more bread, so they invent elaborate irrigation channels.
Why else do you
canals,
think bread is
dams
so
that'll
big
be
in
used
Minecraft,
all
too?
over the world for thousands of years, all inspired by everyone's love of
And a lot of different video games in general.
growing more bread. The Egyptians are also conducting wild scientific experiments.
I'll be honest, this is my first food theory video that I've watched. It's hard to hear Matt Pack's voice not talk about games. I think that's why I brought up the Minecraft reference.
Find more ways to eat bread. Kind of like the Alton Browns of the desert,
History, though,
experimenting
is
with
normal.
grinding up the wheat and actually mixing it with other stuff. Up to this point, most people were just kind of toasting up wheat seeds and packing them together with some water, then scalding the whole thing in a fire to make a flat, crackery little slab. But the Egyptians, they get wild with it. They make
We're
a
gonna make
paste
it
out of
puffy.
ground up wheat and water, which they then leave out in the sun, inventing the entire process of yeast fermentation. Now,
Ooh.
other civilizations have done fermentation.
Oh, we're gonna get into beer, aren't we? And all the different offshoots of bread. Okay.
Before. I mean, we've invented beer at this point. We're
Okay.
not monsters. But this
There
is
you
like
go.
a whole new frontier for bread. Like the latest TikTok craze, everyone wanted to get their hands on this bread that actually rises for exactly the same reasons.
Get this bread.
Follow trends today. The clout. The upper classes can now lord it over the
clout.
little peons still
I got
eating
bread.
flatbread made out
That's
of
where it comes from. That's literally why that slogan still survives to this day. Get yo bread equates to clout, and it's always been like that throughout history.
barley instead of cool, puffy wheat. Bread is such an essential part of life that it becomes completely linked with the Egyptian gods, and all religious practices involve offerings of bread. The god Osiris, who is not only the Egyptian god of death and rebirth, but also agriculture, has illustrations showing wheat literally growing out of his body to symbolize resurrection.
Epic.
During festivals in ancient Egypt, priests bake
I wanna
something
be
known
bread.
as the divine bread, which is bread in the shape
I'm just now realizing like we glorify our pets as loaves of bread. We love our dogs and we love our bread. So why not combine the two?
Osiris, who himself was also bread. We're just gonna go with it. Isis, the sister of Osiris, is the goddess of wheat and barley, and by proxy beer, and is also known as
sucks.
the divine baker. She's supposedly
always liked that name,
responsible
but
for teaching mankind how to make bread. Really
kind of
shafting the Sumerians
can't
who were
name-
doing
I
it
can't name my daughter
20,000
that
years
anytime
earlier.
soon.
Everyone's plagiarizing these days. But not only is bread making mythology happen, it's making everything happen. Want to build a pyramid using slave labor? Gonna have to feed them. Bread's gonna come in handy for that. Want
There
to
you
raise
go.
an army? Just tell them to pack some bread and a spear. They're good to go.
Literally,
Wanna
you can
trade
give
with the
bread to
nations around
everyone.
you?
It's funny how, like, yeah, it doesn't matter how rich or poor you are, bread is epic.
Here's something that might not have been seen before. It's bread. Turns out the Egyptians could grow bread well, and a lot of it, to feed a lot of people. Admittedly, not everyone needed the whole yeast rising process. The Israelites, for example, are like, you guys are mean. You keep your stupid bread bubbles.
they
We got
left.
better things to do. And so they take their matzah and flee Egypt. But the rest of the world is like, put that bread in my face right now. Egypt is incredibly powerful
There's
because
different
they have
forms
the
of bread.
power,
That's
the
the
bread.
thing.
And this will become the pattern for every other nation who gets and grows a lot of wheat. Just watch, because next, bread does something amazing. It crosses the sea. Well, I mean,
To
the
the
sailors
Mediterranean,
cross the sea. The bread actually
the Greeks,
lives rent-free on
and the
boats,
Romans.
just like it does in my mind. And now bread is in Greece. As soon as it hits the shores of Greece, bread
Okay, so we really are going to go through, I think, the whole history of timeline where bread plays a major role, obviously.
Bread is the hot item, which you can see reflected again in a huge number of Greek myths and gods that all revolve around the power of bread.
Is there
The main
bread
one is
Greek god?
Demeter, the goddess of the harvest.
I guess there is.
agriculture,
And there you go. See, my mythology knowledge is not very, I'm not good at Egyptian, Greek, Roman, or even like Nordic mythology. Still find that stuff fascinating, though.
grains. She gives big girl boss vibes.
I'd say the
the
most
Greeks
I know
are like,
is
let's eat bread with every
Greeks.
meal, which sounds like a dream, but it's gonna mean that they need a lot more bread. So much, in fact, that in 600 BC, they invent the first ever
Bam.
closed oven
Bakeries?
specifically for making bread. Before, people were just cooking everything over open fire pits, which were were much less fuel efficient and left less control over the temperature.
You're not going to want to do that.
Using closed ovens, though, the Greeks could suddenly make oodles of bread with less fuel and more consistency, allowing them to feed even more people than the Egyptians could. Just like the Egyptians.
And then bam, is this going to talk about the shifting of power because of how well nations can make bread? That is interesting. I think that's might be where we're going. So from the Greeks, we're going to go to the Romans.
Just there so the Greeks
we're going to cross the Adriatic Sea.
And you know what?
Because they're going to be better at making bread.
They develop a baker's guild. And before you know it, the bread they make is on its way to Rome and Persia. As people push to the east to get access to the really crazy stuff like salt, they spread bread to the areas that we now know as Western Asia. It's here that the new bread making techniques really take off. Wheat is a key part of the Persian Empire, especially when it comes to flatbread. They spread flatbread throughout the
pre-Islamic time still
Asia
for the Middle East.
It's durable, it's easy to transport, and it's a cinch to make even when you're traveling without any sort of special equipment. All you need is a really flat rock and a fire to heat it up.
At this
point, the only nations in the Mediterranean powerful enough to rival each other are the Greeks and the Persians. So of course, the two of them go to war. Ever heard of Aeneas, the Battle of Marathon? Xerxes, who invaded Greece in the year 300?
Love that characterization of this guy. I still love that movie. I know it's not accurate, but 300, I like it.
What happens, and sure, you can learn all the names of the heroes and the battles and all that stuff, but what it really comes down to is bread versus bread and who has more bread. And the answer is the Romans. Rome, in their classic move of stealing everything from the Greeks, quickly adopts bread as the food source for their new empire and proceeds to beat everyone with their
They didn't even try to change the homework around when they copied it. They just switched their name at the top.
Awesome new inventions for making more bread. They injected lots of bread references into their own gods, like Ceres as the equivalent of Demeter. And while Rome certainly liked the smaller ovens that Greece had come up with, they're like, yeah, but what if we did it bigger? And so they made the first bakery-sized ovens to outfit commercial and government bakeries to supply bread to the masses.
No wonder the Romans got so big.
Here comes bread's latest play for world domination, politics. See, the Romans don't win over 2/3 of Europe.
This is the map I show all the time. You need food to supply your empire, and bread is relatively easy to make, at least compared to a lot of other things.
Big chunk of Asia and like that massive top section of Africa for nothing. They also don't do it by keeping a massive standing army or holding everyone under martial law. That would be impossible. No, the way they do it is with bread. The Roman Empire knows that everyone's really into the stuff. So to keep populations loyal to them, they set up government-sponsored welfare in the form of Kyora Anonai, or a grain dole that provides grain or bread to hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens. You ever hear about all those?
I'm thinking of like Civilization series and a lot of other strategy games that make you build those
great roads that Rome built back in the day. They did it to transport bread, or at least the wheat to make the bread, which they imported from Egypt, Sicily, and other places across the empire, and then distributed to all the poor of Rome. Guess who's not going to rebel against you? People getting shipments of food from you.
Good point.
Bread is the most efficient, portable, and tasty form of nutrition the world has ever seen. All the cool kids have it, which means that everyone else wants to be a part of the in-crowd and get in on those hot bread trade routes. The populations who receive bread.
Humans really do love bread to like an instinctual level, it feels like sometimes. I'm now finally understanding this video.
Empire grow from about 40,000 to about 200,000.
Wow.
Guess what? They stayed.
It's crazy that, I mean, all that land only held 200,000 people around that time. This is just population that received bread. I see.
They stay loyal.
I'm not,
Rome's play to win over the world with
Roman
bread
definitely
is best
had
known
millions.
by the phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, a phrase still used to this very day because there are two things in the world.
Because that's how you keep people entertained. You feed them, their bellies are full, and you keep them entertained. To watch a guy get eaten by a lion, at the core, who doesn't want to see that?
That you need to keep the lowly masses placated. You give them bread, and you keep them entertained. Why? Because bread wins, and when the bread runs out, so does your empire. Back in old Rome, the systems for doling out bread to the masses become incredibly popular, as you would expect. But in the later years of the Roman Empire, their strategy starts to backfire, because people simply stop working and instead wait for the emperor to just give them their bread. There's a massive decline in productivity, Roman innovation, and of course, no one wants to join the army when you can just sit at home and get free stuff all the time. So Rome's footprint begins to shrink when the bread bureaucracy gets bigger than its army. When the edges of the empire start shrinking.
Bread is the thing that brought down the Roman Empire?
Standing out there to defend it, the bread imports stop flowing, the bread doles stop doling,
and then they're going to
Empire
split.
Comes to a standstill to make way for newer, breadier competitors. From here
East.
through about the 1400s, things split a little between East and West, depending on which flavor of Christianity you pick. There were only two
Orthodox.
flavors, which put you either landing in the Byzantine Empire or the Holy Roman Empire, both of which are ruled by powerful
interesting. Mad Pack. A little bit of a controversial statement right there.
Flavors, which put you either landing in the Byzantine Empire or the Holy Roman Empire.
Big difference between, Western Rome that fell and then the HRE that came up a couple of centuries later. A lot of people don't consider the Holy Roman Empire to actually even be Roman, that whole quote, not holy, not Roman, not an empire.
Both of which are
Either
ruled
way,
by powerful people, and by people,
fine,
I mean
fine.
powerful bread.
Let it
For the
pass.
Byzantine Empire, which is headquartered in Istanbul, way back when it was Constantinople, not Istanbul, thanks we might be giants, bread is the most important thing they have. Yeah,
Oh, is
sure,
that the
they have
song?
olives and spices and whatever else from the Greeks, but to feed 1 million people now living in Constantinople, they needed one thing more than anything else. They need bread. The Guild of Bakers in Constantinople are considered to be a protected group at this time, and no one can interfere with the making of bread in any way, because everyone knows that once the bread stops getting made, the city shuts down. The wealthy eat the great fluffy bread, the peasants continue to eat hard yucky bread.
This is exactly what I was talking about. Everyone has their different forms of bread, whether you're poor or rich. They're still eating bread, there's just gonna be a lot of different types.
The monks are usually on a fast, so that kind of takes care of itself.
There
Meanwhile, over at the Holy Roman Empire, bread has already been spread to places like Gaul, where people have adopted it immediately because before they were eating porridge. Christianity is the name of the game here, but like the Romans, Greeks, and Egyptians before them, bread still figures heavily into religion, which figures heavily into governing.
Oh yeah, you get fed the bread, that's right. Where's the wine at?
Give us this day our daily bread. Jesus is the bread of life. Jesus
multiplying
I forgot about that bread, and Jesus breaking bread with his disciples are all stories and ideas that figure heavily at this time. Faithfulness to God is tied to the idea of getting
I'm loving bread even more now. I've always been a stand for bread though.
Enough bread, especially since everyone from all corners of Europe are eating about 2 pounds of bread every day, including using it as plates, which they call trenches. Bread is so central to both the Holy Romans and the Byzantines.
I love that breads can be
start stepping
plates.
into control
I forgot about that.
using methods
that's
like
what they are.
price
I guess
fixing.
that's what
They
a
set
pizza
the price
is.
of bread low enough to be affordable, which was another bread invention that continues to this very day. But as soon as you lose the bread, you start losing the power. After a couple centuries of
I want to make my own bread. I need to build my own bakery.
Plagues throughout Byzantium, the vulnerable empires left open, and some neighbors start conquering the lands that
the
produce
Ottomans,
the grain.
here they
and
come.
You know the story by this point, it's the beginning of the end. Slowly, the Byzantines become disorganized and fall to the Turks, who, surprise, surprise, control the grain-making areas of Eastern Europe and the Middle East. So you get it, right? We've been through, what, 5 empires now? I think you're starting to get the picture that bread is responsible for the history of the world. But you know what? I can hear your skeptical comments. Yeah, Matt Pat, but that was then. The world has gone gluten-free at this point. We don't fight with pole arms anymore. Modern people stopped caring about bread long ago, right? Wrong. Throughout the centuries of Gaul, which became what we
bread still plays a massive part to everything to this day.
Now know as France, the biggest uprisings and rebellions all centered around a shortage of bread. The Grand Rebellion in Lyon in 1529, poor grain harvests lead to the working peasants having no bread, so thousands of them break into the city's granaries to take back.
This is making me think of one example, though. I don't think we're going to talk about the Irish. They ran out of potatoes. Potatoes very different than bread, but
the grain from the government. 1590,
potatoes become a nice
Paris,
staple
where
for a
normally
while.
Parisians are eating 1.5 to 2.5 pounds of bread a day. They become so desperate for bread during the months-long siege, they grind human bones to make bread flour, which ultimately leads to the king surrendering and France changing religions. Fast forward to the 1760s, where totally unregulated grain production leads to extremely high prices on bread, and people start to starve. In 1775, people start rioting for bread. This isn't called the French
I was going to say
Revolution
Napoleon
at the time,
coming
it's
up.
called the
Yeah,
Flour
this is still
War,
before
because
that.
people are seriously hangry without their baguettes.
But this is also what France just does. France gets angry, riots in the street. They still do that to this day. It's kind of a cultural tradition at this point.
1889. You think the storming of the Bastille was all about getting weapons? It was about getting bread. Sure, the mobs had their torches and their pitchforks, but you know what they were looking for? The royal store of grain. They were literally starving. Marie Antoinette is painted as a villain when she hears about the flour shortages and famously says, "Qu'ils mangent de la brioche," which doesn't mean let them eat cake. It actually means let them eat brioche, which is a luxury form of enriched bread, because bread is still considered to be the be-all, end-all of eating.
Brioche?
She probably didn't even actually say this, but the power of a statement about bread is the single most famous and inflammatory quote to come out of the entirety of the French Revolution.
That's funny,
But
when we still say
France,
this to this day.
They're a bit nutty for their bread.
They are?
Not by a long shot.
Oh, are they not the top? I was just about to bring that up. Apparently, it's Turkey with the highest bread consumption, which is kind of funny. Maybe he's going to get into that, but with Constantinople/Istanbul, this is just kind of funny bringing up the fact that countries that eat a lot of bread, like France and Italy, aren't necessarily overweight, too. I mean, this video is talking about you can eat bread.
The British. Sorry, Tom, she's included here as well. The British Empire, famous for taxing early American.
I mean, humans have been eating it for obviously thousands of years, like we've been seeing.
American colonists on tea are actually plagued with another big problem in the years leading up to the American Revolution: bread shortages. Well, not as famous as the Boston Tea Party, in 1775, thousands of poor American colonists protest from Philadelphia to Salem about the shortage shortages of grain and the incredibly high bread prices, most of which are controlled by the British government. In an article by Barbara Clark Smith, she writes, quote, "Thousands were reported clamoring for bread, and crowds escorted a merchant, a butcher, and a
literally history changes when people run out of bread.
Jail. As it happened in Boston 2 years earlier, crowds assumed the power to identify and punish enemies to the patriot cause. Once again, the enemy of the bread is the enemy of the people. And wouldn't you know it, one little revolution later, and things really start taking off.
Here
for
goes
that new
Washington to
country
get
of
his
America.
bread.
And why is that? Because wheat is produced in almost every state in the entire country. Heck, we have a specific region called the Wheat Belt. We're always singing about our amber waves of grain. I think it's an accident that the U.S. became a global superpower over the last few hundred years. It shouldn't be when you look at how much bread we have.
Bread and cheese. I just want to say, I know this video is not about cheese, but we have literal cheese caves where we store cheese in case we run out one day.
We export almost 50 million tons.
I do wish this video had a follow-up. Maybe he will, but I mean, cheese, the history of cheese is also pretty big up there. Probably not as big because bread is such a staple throughout like humanity.
Every year. Let's just say that policies around producing wheat can get pretty heated, so I'm not going to be going into all that. But to give you an indication, the U.S. government has paid out over $48 billion in wheat subsidies since 1995, all to support wheat production in this country because, once again, say it with me, bread is power. Whew, and with that, we are at the present day. Whew, that took a lot out of me. I hope I've convinced you now that the entire history of the world comes down to bread, and all you have to do is follow who has the bread at any given time. But if you've been watching this channel for a while, you should probably be asking yourself one thing. Why bread? Like, why? Why not any other food item in the entire world? Sure, bread's delicious.
I think I can see why he chose bread again. I mean, it's discovered very early on. Also beer.
But so are baked potatoes, and you could grow those pretty easily.
Yeah,
so
potatoes.
Are beans, and no, beans suck. But you can grow them, so why not something like the legume civilization? That's a question that was on the mind of one particular cultural anthropologist, Dr. James C. Scott of Yale University, who went and wrote an entire book observing that if you wanted to build an early civilization, you needed to have a grain-based economy, because grain was the only way to have an economy in the first place. If you notice something throughout this episode, it's that people used bread to get what they wanted. Sure, they ate the bread, but they also traded bread to get everything else they needed.
To get other
at the end of the day, bread isn't just the food source of all these
it's literally
civilizations,
currency.
it's also the currency. Sure, they may have had gold coins or fancy little francs or whatever, but that's all bogus if everyone is starving. Bread is power because bread is literally
you have to feed your
money
people
that you can eat. And the rulers of all these empires,
money that you can eat.
Remember, most of these empires were on giving free bread to people. Grain was the basis of taxation in all these empires because in order to give food to people who don't have it, you need to take it away from the people who do. And why are you taking grain? Well, grain like wheat is special for three big reasons. First, it's transportable. You need it if you're going to have a big empire with a huge transportation network for food. And what makes something easy to transport? Number two, being light and dry. So it's not going to rot and you won't be carrying around a whole bunch of water weight.
Takes a while to get moldy.
These criteria that crops like potatoes, lotus roots, most other root starches, they're all out. Potatoes are 70 to 80% water by weight. And water, it's heavy. They didn't have dehydrated instant flakes back in the day, which also meant that they weren't able to easily divide up something like a potato. Wheats and grains,
interesting. Potatoes obviously can be harder to produce at times.
They're very divisible. You can weigh them out down to the 10th of an ounce, so you know exactly how much you're getting or how much you're giving away when you're portioning out doles to the peasants. It also grows, number 3, above ground, which doesn't seem like it should be that big of a deal, but it's everything to these empires. Remember, the entire idea of a central government only exists if that government's able to collect taxes from the citizens. Again, these taxes aren't money, they're crops. When someone's growing wheat, they can't hide it. You can literally see the wheat growing months before harvest season, so a tax assessor can roll on by and estimate a farmer's yield for the year. Then you come by at the same precise time every year, and you take your cut right as everything's getting harvested. Potatoes, root veggies, some beans, they're not visible. They're grown underground or very close to the soil. And that means that farmers can more easily hide them from the government. They can tell the tax collector, oh yeah, we had ourselves a terrible harvest this year. Barely any potatoes, but here's your 10%, I guess. And the tax collector would have no way to know if they were lying. They're a great crop if you're a tax evader, which means that they're terrible if you're a government that's trying to collect taxes. A terrible example of governments only being interested in wheat happened during the Irish potato famine.
Here we go. We are going to talk about
this. During this time, it's well known that the Irish were super reliant on potatoes as one of their only food sources. And there are lots of reasons for that, but any idea why they didn't have any wheat around during this period? Well, they did, but a large portion of it was being exported to the British for compulsory
I was wondering if he was going to mention that. Yep.
Who owned Ireland at the time. So, because wheat was easy to transport, the British were more than happy to take it all, while the hundreds of thousands of Irish people died because of the failure of their less taxable potato crop. So, there it is. We're done. Wheat runs the whole world. What? I didn't talk about the whole world? I forgot about all those other continents like South America, the entire eastern part of Asia.
Yeah, I was waiting for that part. If you didn't cover that, I was gonna hit that.
Most of the continent of Africa, all of Australia.
Specifically
yeah,
looking
right.
at Asia.
I didn't actually forget about them, but I did focus on the areas of history that this audience is probably most familiar with. But that's not nearly the end of the story, so here's how the mighty bread plays
Definitely,
out in
the audience is gonna be more geared towards North America and Europe for sure.
The secret, friends, is this. Having wheat in your country isn't about being smarter than other countries around you. It's not about having better weapons or more technology or whatever. It's all luck. The reason Central and Southern Africa didn't figure heavily into the bread wars over the last few thousand years is that these areas weren't well suited for growing grains. Wheat, as it turns out, is a little bit picky about where it grows, and it needs temperate climates and loamy
I guess in terms of a world scale, it definitely is.
Soil. That's great if you're in the Fertile Crescent, but crummy if
it goes pretty wide compared to other things.
You're in the Ivory Coast. If you look at the world map of where grains grow on this planet, you'll notice a few conspicuous
everything near the equator, yeah, it's going to be a bit more difficult.
Absences,
or
notably in a huge part of South
area.
and Central America, as well as
a huge
portion
jungle.
of the African continent, Northeastern Asia, and in Central Australia. Primarily because most of these places, they're too hot. But you can see that these areas won't be able to come into power using bread alone like us cheaters in Europe, North America, and Central Asia. Their stories play out much like our own, only using a different cereal crop, corn. Corn, or maize, if you're not speaking American English, was a staple crop of Mesoamerican civilizations over yonder in Central and South America. As we've said repeatedly throughout this episode, the history of civilization is really the history of grains. Again, offering those three advantages that you associate with the grain. It's easily transportable, it's easily measurable, and it's clearly
bit heavier
though,
isn't
farmers from evading their taxes. And much like the Greeks and Romans infused wheat into their mythology, Mesoamerican mythology swaps all of that out with corn. The Aztecs had Santiago, the maize god, who we see surrounded by corn, while the Mayans take the idea of grain, and specifically maize, and turn it into the building block of human civilization.
They got the elote lady too. She's still crucial.
Literally, where the Mayan creation myth begins with humanity literally being sculpted from dry corn. And just like other civilizations, they had other options to choose from like potatoes, but freeze-drying these to make them transportable took an incredibly long time. Whereas corn, it could be dried right on the stalk. After the decline of the Mayans and Aztecs, largely because of changes to the climate that kept them from producing enough corn, you see the Incas further south in Peru spreading their influence, knowledge, and culture through, say it with me now, bread. Only this time it was bread made from corn. The Incas were master agricultural engineers, and rather than just outright conquering neighboring people groups, they just showed up and said, hey, how about we help you grow better corn? And everyone's like, yeah, I'll take that. And the Incan Empire thrives until the Europeans show up and ruin everything like they tend to, bringing it all
specifically Spain
back together into one unified timeline. On the other end of the world, stay with me here, this is gonna get tricky, the same thing happens again. Zooming in on the other
the billboard stuff.
Side of the ocean and looking at that grain map again, you get a big old pocket in this middle area of China that's a good...
You know, I was gonna look this up myself, but I had it in the back of my mind, I'm like, he's gotta cover China, right? He's gotta cover Asia. Deeper east.
Which is why grain appears right there on the national emblem of China. Except this time we're not talking about wheat or corn, we're talking rice. But
that's right.
Egyptians were becoming an early major civilization through the power of wheat. Asia had a growing empire of its own.
That was a huge lingering question at the beginning of this video. I'm like, this is a really Western focused video because I know I was mainly focused on China, but bread less popular there.
What we now know as modern day China. And just like civilizations took off in ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt because the conditions were just right for growing grains, we can see a similar pattern throughout Asian history. If you wanted to support a government that could collect taxes and efficiently distribute food as a resource, you needed to have conditions that were right for grains. Enter the balmy, humid Yangtze River Valley, perfect for rice cultivation and the cradle of Chinese civilization, in much the same way that the Fertile Crescent was for Mesopotamia. You may have heard about the Three Kingdoms period in ancient Chinese history.
Total War game too, that was pretty cool.
Where three rival states existed, the Shu, the Wu, and the Wei. It probably comes as no surprise that for each of these three kingdoms, you can trace the source of their power to some ideal condition that allowed them to cultivate rice. Shu had the Sichuan Basin, Wei had the Yellow River Valley, and Wu had the lower Yangtze River. In the same way that grain was a source of government power in the Western world, rice and the conditions for growing it represented power in the Eastern world. And while sure, rice isn't always made into bread, it is made into buns and noodles and all kinds of bread-adjacent products. It also functions in the same way as bread, and most importantly of all, drives the same power dynamic that fuels everything in history. So there you have it, friends. The history of the world.
Food is important. Food, yes.
Is all just bread. In the future, is it possible that the history of the world will still rely on something as simple as bread? Even in the face of all the weapons and technology and AI and Amazon? Yeah, I think it will. Follow the bread, and you'll always see who's in the power seat.
We will be on like spaceships to other solar systems, and we're gonna have to figure out a way to bring wheat, grow that stuff, so we can have our beautiful bread.
Oh, if you'll excuse me, after making it through the last few tens of thousands of years of history, I'm on a little slice of toast. And as always, my
Really nice to see MatPat talking history. I know he's done that before, but it feels good.
friends, remember,
It's bread, it's bread, it's bread.
a food theory.
Very nice. I would definitely enjoy an entire episode on rice. That's what I kept thinking about. Bill Wirtz single-handedly created an entire genre of video essays. It's true. People are still referencing that. Really hoping we get more history videos before MatPat's final narration, his final video. And that was Food Theorist. Please go subscribe. That was a fun way to look at the timeline of human history, but through one of the most important things. And thank you to the patrons. You can go to the link in the description down below to patreon.com to support me. JohnDenver, Jack Traven's annoying friend. I can't sleep without Drew's voice. InquisitorXarius, Fredrik Tibblin, DrewI'mYourDadBackWithTheMilkLookOutside, it's your dad back with the DaBeautiful-MEGAN-Underwood, Carmel Saida, Amateur Archaeology,
RyeThePie,
Sebby, if you hear this, I love you,
Mexican 760,
LuxembourgLover, Tambre, and ZaneyBoi.